can start, right.
I'm interested in getting to the bottom of why.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Very good to see you all here. I think we're going to have an extremely interesting event because we are going to get two very contrasting types of poverty, very contrasting types of poverty policy areas. And I think a discussion about how they do and don't cross over is going to be something rather new for the ODI's way of approaching things. So I'm looking forward to hearing about both pieces of research. I'm Polly Toynbee from The Guardian, and I write mostly about more about poverty at home than abroad, so I expect and hope to learn a great deal. We're going to start off with Andrew Shepherd, who is the director of the Chronic Poverty Research Centre at the ODI, and he's going to talk about tackling chronic poverty, the policy implications of research on chronic poverty and poverty dynamics.
Thank you, Polly. Just before I get into my talk, there are one or two practical things that as an ODI person I should say here. One is that if you need the toilet, the ladies is over there, and just out of the room and along the corridor, and the gents is down in the other direction and round to the left, not very far away. If there's if a fire alarm should go, it means that there is a genuine risk of fire. It's not a practice, and what we do is just to go out the way that you've come in, down the stairs and out onto the street. When it comes to the questions and answers afterwards, please wait for a microphone, because we are streaming this session. There are people listening in online. We may have some questions coming from them as well, and if you haven't got the microphone, they won't be able to hear you. And we're also recording the session. Just finally, there are some publications on the table over there, so please do have a look at those afterwards and take whatever you want, and there are some books that you can sign up for as well. Okay, well, on to my presentation. I'd first like to thank Polly Toynbee for showing interest in this research, and to everybody who's contributed to bringing what has been a very long research partnership to a close with these key messages. In particular, Portia Reyes and Anna Simmons here at ODI, who've helped get the materials together, and the communications department at ODI, who've set up the meeting. I'd also like to thank lots of Chronic Poverty Research Centre colleagues, some of whom are sitting here. Kate Bird, who led work on intergenerational transmission of poverty. David Hume, who's been co-director since 2000. And Kim Kayunze, who was also involved in research in Tanzania. So there are lots of others. It's been a very substantial partnership in a dozen countries and with links to other countries. It's coming to an end in its current form, but the network will continue and expand to include more policymakers, hopefully, and practitioners as a chronic poverty advisory network. The paper's summary, if you have a look at the paper on page Roman 6, boils the messages for policymakers down to 5. This presentation will give you a slightly longer version, and we'll also spend a little bit more time exploring some of the less well-accepted ideas and issues. So, for example, it will not dwell too long on social protection policy responses, as these have become quite well internalized, at least at the international level. I mean, there are still many issues about getting social protection firmly on the agenda in many countries and indeed in many international organizations. But we feel that it's there in a way that some of the other issues that we're wanting to raise are not. If you're particularly interested in social protection, we have some conclusions which are summarized in box 8 on page 26 of the report. And there's also a report which is on the slide here, Social Transfers and Chronic Poverty, and I think there are copies of that report. Is that right, Portia? On the table, if you want to pick that up. So social protection will feature in the story, but perhaps not as much as some of you might have expected. Right from the beginning, it's been the intention that this research should contribute to better policy responses to poverty. Now, it's almost blue skies research in the sense that we've been looking beyond 2015. Many of you are familiar with the Millennium Development Goals and the targets which were set to be reached in 2015. And what we've said is we're looking at the responses to poverty which go further than the targets which have been set. Now, in this sense, it's early days for a research centre looking at the longer term, in a sense, to expect to see impacts on policy. But despite that, we've been monitoring what those impacts might be. And we feel that there are some impacts. Some countries, their policy statements are beginning to take account of chronic poverty a little bit, some quite a lot. In fact, the India 11th five-year plan took quite a substantial account of chronic poverty issues. There have been some particular policies which have been impacted, social protection policies here and there, particularly Uganda. In terms of national poverty analysis and the kind of quality and the content of national poverty analysis, we feel that, from the assessment that we've done, we think that it hasn't improved hugely over the last decade, so perhaps there are very much improvements to come there. But poverty responses in many countries have become more sophisticated, a bit more disaggregated, for example, and have begun to recognize some of the issues which I'll be referring to. As far as the donors are concerned, we've had substantial interest from many agencies within the donor community, from DFID at various points. From Germany recently, they're developing a new poverty reduction policy, USAID, moving the chronically poor out of their humanitarian box and into the development box from UNICEF and so on and so forth. So although I think this is still an agenda for the future, there are impacts on policy which still need to be made, and on poverty analysis, we do feel that we're beginning to make an impact. So we reckon, and this comes from the Chronic Poverty Report that we published in 2008, that out of the $1.4 billion a day poor in the world, nearly 500 million people are chronically poor. So are poor over substantial periods of time. They may be poor over their entire life. Their children, they may pass their poverty on to their children. Just a map that we developed to show where these people are. The size of the country in this map, cartogram, represents the number of people who are absolutely poor, extremely poor. And the colors, the red represents the most multidimensional poverty, according to national indicators, and the yellow is the next most. So you can see that very substantial concentration in Africa and South Asia, no particular surprises there. Mostly chronically poor people work, but they're often excluded, they're often not incorporated into the world of work very well, or for that matter into domestic relationships, sometimes into political relationships. They're without many assets, perhaps at the sort of lowest level of asset holding, and they're very vulnerable. The poverty black box, or the poverty reduction black box, I think the world looks at, but the world of decision makers tends to look at the incidence of poverty, how many people are poor, what proportion of the population is that, and how that indicator responds to economic growth and human development. It's a bit of a black box in there. Underneath the statistics, people of course are, some people are doing well, some people are doing badly, some people are chronically poor. There's mobility, there's movement, and there's also persistence. And what we've tried to do in our work, in what you might call a new poverty diagnostic, is to unpack this with the 4 Ds. Well, this is not, hopefully not too trite. It's actually fairly serious when it comes to poverty analysis. So, in fact, if much poverty analysis in developing countries now does disaggregate the first D, at least by identifying vulnerable groups. And the Millennium Development Goals internationally recognize the importance of multiple dimensions of deprivation. But we argue that this is not enough. To understand the contours, the nature, the causes of poverty, and why some of it persists, policymakers need to focus on the dynamics. Entries into, exits from, persistence in poverty. So, for example, the fact that upward mobility out of poverty is gradual, is often gradual, but includes experiencing setbacks, evidence from several countries that we've worked in, Bangladesh, Senegal, Tanzania, suggests that people need protection as they're on their way up, as much as the proverbial leg up from a loan or an inheritance or an improved market. And the enabling conditions under which people can slowly accumulate assets, the financial markets, the inheritance rules and norms, the markets which determine returns to assets, these are also critical. So here is a visual representation of a life story. This is Habib, who is a 53-year-old man in Bangladesh. And I'm not going to go through this in detail, but what you can see here is that he's moved, when he was a child, he was very poor and very vulnerable, in a very vulnerable household. He's moved up quite considerably through what is called here levels 1, 2, and 3, which is pretty much to the poverty line, or a little bit above the poverty line, if you like, towards the latter part of his life. But you can see that there are lots of shocks along the way which cause setbacks. And there are also positive shocks underneath which propel his household upwards. But the shocks along the top are pretty significant. People being killed, separation, fighting amongst brothers, sometimes a sister being married or a daughter being born, a daughter ill, and so on. Lots of these things can make a considerable difference at these sorts of levels of welfare to how well people are doing. So the implication here would be that you need to think about, if you're wanting to encourage people out of poverty, you need to think about protecting them along the way. Protection is not just to prevent people entering into poverty. It's very much helping people escape from poverty. Similarly, downward mobility into poverty, into chronic poverty, happens when several shocks coincide at the same time or come in sequence. So protecting against one shock at a time, or protecting one vulnerable group through a particular policy dedicated to that vulnerable group, may not make much sense. You actually need to search for social protection interventions which will hit several targets at the same time. So the social protection discourse, although I said what I said at the beginning, is incredibly important in all this, and I wouldn't want to minimize it. There will be a book coming out on poverty dynamics and chronic poverty in Africa and Asia, edited by Bob Balch later on this year, and these issues will be dealt with in much greater detail in that book. Now, people who are stuck in poverty at the bottom are actually, in many cases, stuck there for structural reasons. There can be deep relational and process barriers to upward mobility, which require policies which transform the basic conditions of their lives and the enabling environment. So this means economic relationships between employees and employers, relations between different market actors, gender relationships, intergenerational, intergroup discrimination, and so on. These fundamental things need to be transformed. Now, the fourth D is differentiating policy responses. So in response to this more dynamic picture of poverty, you can produce, if you like, a more sophisticated and differentiated range of policy responses. Policy responses which prevent entry, promote exit, or address people who are persistently poor. So on this slide, we start with preventing entries into poverty. The health and social transfer, social protection agendas, I think are the most straightforward of these agendas. They're not necessarily cheap, but they are doable in most situations. They're practical solutions which can open the door for some of the more difficult policy areas, such as enhancing women's agency. And the latter is particularly particularly important in interrupting intergenerationally transmitted poverty. Now, there are many ways to do this. Nutritional interventions to improve mothers' and children's nutrition, better education for girls and women, preschools, quality primary, and increasingly access to post-primary education. campaigning for a later age of marriage to support both of these, anti-discrimination measures, gender-sensitive social protection to protect assets and other measures, for example, inheritance reforms, to prevent the asset stripping of the kind experienced by Binti Musa. And if you would like to just have a quick look at an extract from a life history, have a look at page 14 of the report, box 6, where you will see the process of asset stripping following divorce illustrated. We've actually focused some recent effort, which has been reported in a previous session at ODI, on the role of inheritance, because it seemed a neglected but important area of policy, and I think there are some papers which have been produced for you on the table on this. In the context of HIV/AIDS in particular, women's loss of access to property and consequent impoverishment has been widespread. There's also the case where inheritance norms, this is also the case where inheritance norms discriminate against women. Reforming these laws and campaigning on norms and practices is happening in several countries. This is very much a topical policy issue in a number of countries, but there's a degree of contestation around these relatively difficult issues that means that implementing laws, you might be able to get to the point where you've got good legislation in place, but actually implementing the law once it's been reformed can require very strong local leadership and lots of civil society campaigning and monitoring work. It's not a straightforward sort of fix-it type policy approach. In terms of supporting exits from poverty, supporting people escape from poverty, growth is obviously incredibly important. Growth processes which provide space for savings and asset accumulation by poor rural people, urban people. This, for example, in rural areas should include possibilities for simple things like livestock accumulation as an asset. Land and agriculture forms a very important part of many stories of escape from poverty, although in many cases it's not actually agriculture which is going to take you out of poverty. It's a member of a household getting a non-agricultural job, migrating, or somebody in the household developing a non-farm business, which will actually be the tipping point in many cases to take people out of poverty. But agriculture and the accumulation of land as an asset remains in the 21st century for poor people an incredibly important aspect of escaping poverty. And inheriting land is also very much a contribution, can be a contribution to that. So one of the big policy implications is that assets are really important, protecting those assets are really important, and the markets functioning so that the assets generate a return is also important. When you look at policies on those three things, they tend to be formulated separately without consideration of the other policies, and they are the programs and policies are implemented by different organizations. And this is true both in government and it's true in the NGO world. You won't find many NGOs or government departments who do more than one of these things at a time. There are some exceptions. I think BRAC in Bangladesh is a very good example of that. But nobody's really exploring the synergies among these things at the moment, and they're very important. I've mentioned also here location. Clearly, a lot of chronically poor people are in deprived areas. Investing in infrastructure remains an incredibly important aspect. But what we've argued is that it's not enough by itself, that what you need is universal anti-discrimination measures so that people living in remote regions and areas actually have their status improved over time gradually through those universal measures. A finding that we're beginning to articulate is that younger people, maybe not very surprising, may be in a better position to escape poverty. And I'm interested to hear some of the comparisons with the UK on this. This graph from work in Senegal shows that the most recent generation, which is the April 1978 generation on the right-hand side of the graph, is most likely to not to be chronically poor. So the black areas of the graph at the top represent the proportion of the surveyed population that was chronically poor. And you can see that the green areas, the ones who are managing to escape poverty, are greater on the right-hand side. And this is a kind of quantitative representation of the fact in Senegal at least, and I think probably in a number of other places, but this is something that we would need to do more work on. It is young people who find it easier to escape poverty. Now, to what extent is that a difficult issue, or does it present difficult challenges? Inheritance systems that we've just been talking about may not be geared to passing assets on to people when they can best use them. So that's one challenge. A more general challenge is that young people are often invisible. They're within households, so policymakers think about households and don't single out young people. They don't get surveyed, they don't get consulted. You know, surveys are household surveys. Consultation processes very often with heads of households. There's a difference there between urban areas and rural areas. Young people perhaps get a little bit more attention in urban areas than they do in rural areas. What are the ways in which young people manage to escape? And then again, this is back to Senegal. And this is work from survey and life history work there. Escaping poverty requires social processes which build people's social networks, and education, especially getting through to the point where you have a qualification, way beyond the current universal primary education targets that the world has taken. Migration, however far you go, international migration, fantastic, but you know, even local migration can be pretty effective, and again, it exposes you to a much wider network. Joining an association, religious association, football clubs, etc., all of those things. Still on what kind of growth, if you like, what kind of growth processes can help people out of poverty. There can be trade-offs between the rate of growth, the percentage GDP increase per year, and the rate of employment increase or the quality of employment. And these need to be resolved in favour of the quantity and quality of employment if it's going to work, except where there's no growth or very low levels of growth or very volatile growth, where obviously what you want is a smoother, stronger growth path, and then you need to use taxation in order to redistribute the benefits of that growth to poor people. Labour-intensive sectors, agriculture, construction, manufacturing, these are often very important in providing employment, but it may not be very good employment. It's not that low-quality jobs don't contribute to household welfare, they do. Am I running over time? Yes, okay. I'll have to speed up, won't I? Okay, they do, but they may not be enough to escape. So job quality is important. And the problem here is that there are relatively few policy levers. And I'll just summarise very quickly. Social protection again comes up here for informal employment. If you can extend social protection to people who are informally employed, that's one way. Supporting consumer-led pressure. There's a lot of that in global value chains. Consumer-led pressure on labour conditions. Can it be transferred into the domestic arena? Education and skills development, obviously. Okay, well, there are some then very basic causes of chronic poverty which also need to be addressed. We've talked about social protection. We've talked a little bit about anti-discrimination measures, rights-based approaches. India, we've written that up in the India Chronic Poverty Report. It's not a panacea, but it pushes you in the right direction. But there are lots of governance issues and so on which also come up, and I'm going to rush a little bit. This is a highly political agenda, a lot of this. Political elites need to be convinced that chronic poverty is structural. It's not the fault of the chronically poor. There is still a blaming culture out there. One of the things that we found is that you get progress on many of these more difficult issues when you have a cross-state society, civil society coalition. And this may need to be at local level as well, so that you get well contextualized local responses. There's a lot of talk about aiming for good governance, but actually what we perhaps need to move on and think about in terms of poverty reduction is improving the social, economic and political relationships rather than focusing on good governance. I'm just going to talk briefly about context, because obviously we've worked in many countries. We're trying to generalize our findings and our policy implications, but this is a very context-specific set of issues. Countries are extremely different. Even within countries, there are massive differences in context. And this table is an attempt to do that a little bit. Down the left-hand side, you've got different poverty situations. So mass poverty, a more unequal one in the middle, but still with reducing chronic poverty, and then highly unequal chronic poverty barely reducing down at the bottom. South Africa is the example of that. And across the top, different sets of causes, if you like, of chronic poverty. Discrimination in political relationships, structural microeconomic causes, the absence of assets and education and so on, or the overall nature of the state and governance. And what we tried to do with our partners was to put countries into some of these boxes. Very difficult exercise, and Kenya ended up in 2 boxes. But the others seem to fit more or less into those boxes. I mean, I think this is something, it's a little bit artificial, but if you're an international decision maker, these kind of matrices can be quite helpful in seeing what sort of thrust policy and your contribution as an international agency to policy in a particular country needs to follow. And I think it can be taken down to the subnational level as well with good effect. Some conclusions. National policy and action is really what is more important than international policy and action, which can only support action at the national level for a lot of this agenda. General poverty reduction policies, great, the human development services, the economic growth and so on, but I hope what I've suggested is that we also need to have a slightly different set of policies to address chronic poverty. The state-citizen social contract is an incredibly important aspect of all this. Tax-based financing of social protection, of human development services and so on is really important, and that has to be in the context of a good political settlement. And where do we go from here? I mentioned the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network. The idea is that the issue is now out there in a way that it wasn't in 2000 when we started this work. We can now respond to demand from policymakers and practitioners, work together with them to address chronic poverty, and we hope that this network will be an expanding thing over the